Tom Perkins is a world-renowned letter cutter working in what might be termed the Edward Johnston Eric Gill tradition. His thorough grounding in calligraphy and his scholarship has resulted in an approach to letterform that is uniquely creative. Tom, tell us something about your background in calligraphy and how it impacts upon your work.
Well, I got started with calligraphy quite early on in my career. I developed an interest in it, really. I suppose mainly at first through looking at books, I think, in the reference library at Plymouth. And that quickly made me aware, really, of what was going on at that time in calligraphy, about the mid 70s, and I discovered all the famous names like Johnston and Gill, and I think I ordered a copy of Writing, Illuminating and Lettering very early on. I was only about 14, and I got hold of a copy of that. So I was certainly very aware right from the beginning, really, of the importance of calligraphy in one's development as a letterer. And I bought calligraphy, Mitchell's pens, and was writing with those really from my kind of mid-teens. I then went off to, at the time, the only place you could study calligraphy was at Reigate School of Art and Design, and I went to study calligraphy there for a couple of years before I actually did any letter carving. So really before I actually got to do any carving in stone, I'd already done 2 years of calligraphy. But I suppose it wasn't really until I came into contact with Anne Camp in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, when she was starting to get a full-time calligraphy course going at Roehampton, that I started to really become aware of some of the more the more sort of intellectual foundation underpinning modern calligraphy, and Johnston's kind of rational analysis of letter form with his weight, angle and form and those kind of things, to actually give you a way into analysing letter form, which kind of, once you start to understand those basic principles, it really frees you from simply copying letter shapes or just seeing them as a series of styles, but you begin to analyse them and understand them, and then you can begin to modify them and gradually make them your own, really, so that you're not simply working from an outside or external reference model, but slowly internalising these principles so that you can work from an internal reference point.
Tell me what tools you use in your work.
Okay, well, to drive the chisel we use these what we call dummy mallets. They've got an ash handle, wooden handle, and the head is made of malleable iron, so it's just a little bit softer and it gives a bit of grip onto the end of the chisel when you're working like that. The chisels are basically a steel shank with a tungsten carbide inset at the end. You can see this bit coming out at the end here. That's all made of tungsten carbide, which is quite a brittle metal, but it gives a much better working tip which lasts a lot longer. It's a kind of innovation that came in the 1950s. And then we sharpen them on these diamond plates, which are much better than the old carborundum stones, much better to use.
What are your favourite materials, Tom?
Well, there's some time when we're not working Welsh slate in the workshop. This became very popular with lettercarvers after the Second World War and was one of David Kindersley's favourite materials. And I trained with his son Richard Kindersley and also a little bit with David Kindersley, and so it was a material that I was working a lot when I started in lettercarving, which I developed quite an affection for working in. Curiously enough, Eric Gill, who David Kindersley was apprenticed to in the 1930s, and I suppose Gill is very much the person who put lettercarving on the map in the 20th century, seldom used slate much at all. He tended to prefer lighter stones like this Portland stone from Dorset. This is a stone that Wren made famous on a lot of his churches in London, and in particular at St Paul's Cathedral. So as well as being used for letter carving and memorial work, it's also quite famous architecturally. Also York stone from, this is quarried just north of Leeds. It's a sort of slightly harder sandstone. There are various varieties of it. It's quite abrasive on the tools when you're working it, so you have to keep sharpening your chisels quite a bit. And then finally there's green slate from Cumbria. It's a bit harder and grittier than the Welsh slate, but you get interesting surface markings on the stone which give it an attractiveness. I start by making these scale drawings which are sent to the client, but obviously before you prepare all the full-size drawings you need to get as much information as possible, either with correspondence in the post or emails with the client about the kind of scale and types of materials, or best of all a site meeting with the client so that you can resolve all these factors as to scale, whether the inscription needs to be painted, and preferences of any types of materials and things. And when you've gathered all that information in, you can go back to the drawing board, prepare these scale drawings, which are normally about a third or quarter full size. And then when all that's been seen by the client and approved by any official bodies, diocesan committees or whatever who need to see this kind of thing, you could then go ahead, prepare full-size drawings and order the materials. When you've done your scale drawing, the next part really is to set the inscription out full size onto the stone. And there's two ways of doing this really. You can either draw using the scale drawing as a tool to get your lines on the stone. You can then draw the inscription out directly onto the slate or stone. If you're working on slate, it's quite convenient to use a white pencil, and you can sketch the letters like this directly onto the slate. So that's one way of getting the letters down, like that. Then the other method is to draw the letters out on a sheet of layout paper, which I use. It's quite nice to draw on. It's kind of semi-transparent, so you can always put additional layout paper over the top and trace through it. Then you can attach that to the stone or slate, I usually use masking tape to line it up with the lines like that. And then we use this stuff, which is called carbon paper. Put that between the paper and the slate, and then I use an old worn-out biro. Some people prefer to use hard pencils like a 4H because they can see where they've been with the drawing a bit better, and then trace the letters through like this.
Tom, what's the next stage in the process?
Alright, well, you've got your drawn letter, and the first thing is to make a small incision in the centre of the letter, and one normally starts by cutting from the bottom towards the top like this. So I was working from the bottom to the top most of the time, and then having cut that initial incision, you can see how I'm beginning to make these sort of like fishtail endings here and here, which are making ready to make these very distinctive triangular stop cuts at the top and the bottom. So one gradually goes on widening the stem out until you get to the final form. Next, this is showing how to make the triangular stop cuts in a bit more detail. And again, as I was saying earlier, you start with these kind of fishtail shapes, and then you start to get the triangular shape here and here formed, and these just really show the successive stages involved in that process. Then we get on to the letter E, and I was taught to cut the horizontal strokes first before you cut the stem, and you can cut the horizontal strokes well into the stem. You don't have to stop at the edge, because when you cut over it, those will all disappear. And it's supposed that if you do it this way, you're much less likely to chip these corners out here and here and here when you go through, if you cut those before and then cut the vertical stroke over it afterwards. Then we're moving on to cutting curves. Here you have to sort of stop and start in slightly different positions. One might think you sort of start in the middle at the top and the bottom, but in fact you start here and cut an initial cut around in that direction, and then starting back here at the bottom we go round in this direction again. This really then just shows the successive stages in gradually thickening the form up. Here we're cutting the thin parts of the letters first, and then once those are finished you can join around the thicker parts there to make the curve.